Hey everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and in today's video I'm going to talk about two headphones from Beyerdynamic. This is the DT 1990 Pro Mark II and the 1770 Pro Mark II. They're both new-ish. They have a selling price, or at least a retail price, of $600, and I will be comparing them to some other Beyerdynamic headphones I have with me. So we'll compare against the older stuff and some other models to help you kind of understand where these stack up. Now, the DT 1990 Pro Mark II is a $600 open back headphone, has a detachable mini XLR cable, and the new Tesla 45 driver has a 30 ohm impedance. So it's very easy to drive, easier to drive than the older DT 1990 Pro, which had a 250 ohm impedance. And then you have the DT 1770 Pro Mark II, which is a closeback version of it, using the same Tesla 45 driver, so the impedance is also 30 ohms, and thanks to the efficiency that you typically get with a closeback, it's rated for 1 decibel higher of sensitivity. They both have a similar weight, they have a very similar pad dimension, and even their clamp force is the same. So as far as fit and feel, wearing them on your head, there's no real difference ergonomically from how they fit. Now, before I get any further, these were sent to me on behalf of a PR agency from Beyerdynamic, and it won't affect what I say about it. I get no kickbacks, and then when I'm done with the review, I send them back unless I decide to buy products, because that's just how I operate. I also do not participate in any affiliate programs with any of the brands. I never want you to think that there's any monetary exchange that would influence what I have to say. So I just wanted to disclose that. Now, regardless of the DT 1990 Pro Mark II or the DT 1770 Pro Mark II, they both come with the same general accessory kit. They both come with the Hard Case Pro. It's a mostly rigid case. It's not hard plastic. There is some flex to it, but it's rigid enough to physically protect the headphone and store your accessories. When you open them up, you get the same cables with both. You get a coiled cable and a standard TPU rubber straight cable. They both come with their own 6.3 millimeter adapter, which you can unscrew to use it as a 3.5 connection. So I didn't want to open up both just to save time, but you can see the general idea is the same. Now, on the 1990 Pro Mark II, you get two sets of velour pads. They look almost identical. The difference is the amount of holes on the bottom, and that will change the pad type that you're using. You have the producing pad and the mixing pad. The producing pad has a little bit more bass and just a little bit more treble, focused a little bit on that 8 kilohertz peak that Beyerdynamic typically tunes their headphones for, but it's just a matter of personal preference. The mixing pad is a little bit more neutral, less bass, less treble emphasis. Then you have the 1770 Pro Mark II, which has the velour pad, which I really like, and then the leatherette. Now, the leatherette pads have a couple advantages. They have a bass boost, so if you're getting a 1770 Pro Mark II, or you're looking at Beyerdynamic and you want bass, the closebacks typically have a stronger bass, and it's further accentuated by switching to the leatherette pad. That also benefits in terms of noise isolation. So if you're trying to block passively as much of your environmental noise as you can, then switch to the leatherette pad. The only downside to the leatherette, and the big reason why I typically stay with velour personally, sound characteristics aside, is they're not as breathable. That isolation that helps with blocking sound is also trapping in a little bit more heat and moisture as well. So depending on your environment, you may gravitate towards one or the other. Now, getting into build quality and comfort, I want to compare it to the DT 1990 Pro Mark I and compare those to the chassis and modifications to the new Mark IIs, both open and closed. I don't have a 1770 Pro Mark I, unfortunately. It's the only Beyerdynamic I think I do not have in this range. But this would still suffice to an extent. So the original DT 1990 Pro Mark I has a different buckle design. You can see the graphic is written differently. That's one way to identify it. And then you have a different grill design. The new one has more of a textured, like hammered finish, but it has smaller and a higher quantity of screening here for the vents, for being an open back or open acoustic headphone. Whereas this guy is a smoother finish, and it says made in Germany on the bottom here. Overall, it's a very similar design, and then of course the 1770 Pro Mark II has that like textured finish, just like the 1990 Pro, except there's no screen or vent on it. Otherwise, that part looks the same. Now, another change with the 1990 Pro Mark II and 1770 Pro Mark II is the headband has a little bit of a dip there. It's a nice pressure release, and when you compare it, this has been stored and used a bit. I've had this headphone for quite a while now, so it's broken in, but there's just a little bit more pressure up top on the original DT 1990 Pro. On the new ones, not only is this there for a pressure release, which is great even if you don't wear a hat. Obviously, people are going to talk about wearing a hat and a seal. I'm just wearing it for the video. But when you put this on, that pressure release up top really does make a big difference with comfort. It's a big improvement. It's not a suspension strap design, but this design is very compact, which some people will like and prefer. The other improvement is the clamp force is reduced slightly compared to the DT 1990 Pro Mark I and the 1770 Pro Mark I, which uses the same chassis design as this. I do have a rig that I 3D printed and designed and calibrated to measure clamp force, and I was able to not only feel on my head that these felt a little bit lighter, but I measured that same difference as well. For longer listening sessions, that lighter clamp force and fairly light weight, being under 400 grams, makes it comparable to some other products out there. It's kind of in the middle for everything. It's built well. This notch up here really does make a big difference. The breathable pads, the relaxed clamp, I think all of that together means that you can still wear this for a fairly long period of time. It's not wowing me in any way, but I don't find any areas that's particularly uncomfortable or a problem either. And because of this design having this much room on the telescoping yokes, it's going to fit a wide variety of heads as well. You do get a little bit of articulation, so regardless of head size, if your head shape is just slightly different, or depending on how this sits on your jawline, that articulation is going to help make sure the pressure feels even and you don't have a hot point before, in front or behind your ears. Aside from that, there's a lot of similarities to the older headphones, which is a good thing because they are known to be built extremely well. You have this metal fork, which looks great, and this hinge design is extremely durable. I see almost no videos or mentions of people complaining about yoke failure on beyerdynamics, especially in this all metal design. So they're well made. The only thing that I've always noticed that I'm just going to point out ergonomically and build quality wise is I wish this cable was shorter, because on the shortest setting, do you see how the cable kind of tucks in a little bit as far as like protruding inward? If you have a smaller head, you may feel that cable kind of just touch the top of your head. As you extend this out, you can see it starts to clear, but it is still kind of touching your head depending on the shape. Even if you fully extend this cable is never tight. I feel like they could have taken about, I don't know, half an inch off of the cable length and maybe it would have tucked it away better. It is what it is. I just wanted to share that observation. Now, on all beyerdynamics, at least depending on the series, one thing that they're known for is serviceability. A lot of the parts are easily replaced by the user. They don't glue things. You can see the screws here for the knuckle. The pads are obviously removable, but they have another trick up their sleeve beyond the pad. So you can actually turn this, and with the proper tools, so you're not going to risk scratching anything, this pops out. This is basically the ring that secures the pad to the driver cup. And once you remove that, now we have the acoustic fleece here. This cover here is used for tuning. We'll get into sound quality and comfort and all that stuff here in a moment. But you can see that it has like a little bit of a nub that kind of protrudes out a little bit. They have the same pad depth as the older DT 1990 Pro Mark II, at least how I can directly compare it. But because this sticks out just a little bit, when you compare it to the older one, it's flat. And even though the depth is the same, I feel that part just barely kissing my ear. It's not a hard pressure point, but it is there. And then after removing all of that, you can see that the driver is exposed. And then you have, again, this stuff is all here for acoustic purposes and for protecting the driver, but the driver is removable as well. Now, obviously you have to be really careful. And if you're ever removing a driver, you don't want to stick something sharp in there and slip and damage the speaker or anything. So I'm going to just pull a little bit and you can see it just kind of popped out. And look at how easy this is to service. They have this little plug here for the terminal of the driver. And I wanted to take out this 1990 Pro Mark II for a couple reasons. One, I think this design is awesome. The fact that it's this easy to service is great. But even though this is a open acoustic, you can see a lot of it is closed off. There's a lot of cut material here behind the driver. So these aren't fully open. They do have some properties like of a semi-open or semi-closed, depending on how you look at it. That has to do with like reflections and back waves and everything. They do still have decent leakage. This right here is also used for tuning because you're venting the speaker outward. And they have a different sound signature and power handling as a result. But I did want to show you that because it's kind of cool to see what goes on behind the driver. And if you shine a light through it, you can kind of see that little metal behind it. When it comes to sound quality, I like to break it up in two parts. I start with the objective side first, which are my measurements. It takes my opinion out of it. And I use a Gross KB006X Pinaclone with a 711 coupler clone. I only say that because you don't want to compare my measurements to someone else's BK5128, for example. But I did measure a ton of headphones and I used the same testing methodology for all of them. multiple seatings, seating variation, because moving it on your head can change the sound quality. I factor all of that in, and this represents an average of how that rig measures it. So use this for comparing against other measurements I've made, but not necessarily against someone else's. Having said that, if you look at the frequency response of both models, they follow somewhat of a similar beyerdynamic house sound, particularly in the mid-range and the treble region because of that 8 kilohertz peak that still comes through. That's a house sound. It's an intentional sound characteristic of beyerdynamic. When you look at the green line, that is the open back version, the DT 1990 Pro Mark II, which will always have slightly less bass. Open backs are known to be a more natural, wide-sounding headphone. Doesn't always mean that, but in this particular case, it holds true. Now, the 1770 Pro Mark II, when you look at the bass, it's definitely stronger. It's elevated quite a bit, and then there's a mud cut here that they do with a lot of closed-back headphones, because if you have this much bass boosted and into the mid-range, it can make things sound a little bit boxy or overly thick sounding, and they circumvent that by doing what's called a mud cut. And you can EQ this back if you want some of it. Conversely, you can also obviously use EQ to adjust the bass and reduce it further. But when you get in the mid-range, like this whole 400 hertz to just under 2000 hertz or right around there, they are very much the same. I find that a lot of instruments can be voiced similar to each other. It doesn't sound too off whether you got the closed or the open. The biggest difference happens in the 4000 hertz range. Now, this is obviously aside from bass, because the closed back does have a noticeable bass shelf. But the open back version, this pinna gain area around 4000 hertz, you can see it really starts picking up from 3000 hertz and up. It just fills this region in. On the closed back version, it's slightly recessed, which can sound a little bit more relaxed when it comes to vocals, but it can to some people sound less detailed because a lot of people perceive detail in this frequency range. So you can shape this with EQ, but I can tell you out of the box, when you factor in the lighter bass shelf plus more fill-in in the 4000 hertz area and then comparable treble, the 1990 sounds a bit more brighter, but sparkly, energetic, if you will. And I mentioned that you can change pads. So I want to show you the producing pad, and we're going to turn off the closed back. If you switch to the producing pad, this is that subtle bass lift I was talking about. You get a few decibels in your sub bass, and it extends rather well all the way down to 20 hertz. There's not much roll off here. Mid-range tuning is comparable. If you just, depending on how you align the frequency response, the general sound signature is comparable. On the mixing pad, not only do you lose a little bit of a bass, but it also tames that 8 kilohertz peak just a little bit. Now, if you compare this to the older 1990 Pro, the 250 ohm version, I want to kind of keep this apples to apples. This is on the balanced pad, so I'm going to get rid of the mixing pad real quick. You can see a very similar bass profile, a similar mid-range tuning, and there is a difference in the upper mids and low treble. Now, because the older version has much more of a scoop here at 5000 hertz, then it has a stronger 8 kilohertz peak. It makes that 8 kilohertz peak sound stronger. There's less of a fill before and after, so it kind of comes out of nowhere. And depending on what volume level you're listening to, that peak can be quite strong. So I'm happy that they, connected the treble around that peak a little bit better on the Mark II. It's still bright, but it doesn't surprise you as much. It's a more widely presented, brighter treble. The analytical pad on that headphone was very similar to each other. Again, just a slight modification in bass, but a different treble delivery, whereas the analytical pad actually had brighter treble, so I always recommended the balanced pad with that one. Now again, I apologize for not having the original 1770 Pro. I just couldn't get my hands on it in time for this review, but when we look at the 1770 Pro Mark II, this is the velour pad, and if I add the leatherette pad, you can see the impact that it has on bass. A lot of that is seal dependent. Having a better seal will typically amplify bass, but again, I'm pleased to see that they have similar voicing. They really do know how to make pads that target their own house sound. So you can see that it stays true there. A little bit more of a recess here in the 5K, but not by much, and then you're met with that same 8 kilohertz peak. It didn't really change that there. I'll be comparing these to other headphones later, but there is a similar theme I wanted to highlight. The 700 Pro X is a less expensive closeback that still has good build quality, but it has a more reference level sound tuning, not necessarily in terms of detail retrieval, but you can see the 700 Pro X is a little bit less bass. It has a nice fill in here up until about 3000 hertz. There's a big scoop at 4000 hertz, and this is prevalent. I've seen it on a lot of measurements. And the 700 Pro X does not have that 8 kilohertz peak. So as far as being a safer sound signature for some, the 700 Pro X is more of that reference level sound. And a similar thing happens when you look at the 900 Pro X. So I'm going to activate that frequency response, and I'm going to compare it to the 1990 Pro Mark II. The 900 Pro X again has a little bit less bass, similar fill-in where it comes up a little bit higher in the 3K region. And then you have a lift here at 6K that is noticeably brighter. It has more of like a snare, almost like a snappy sound to it on the 900 Pro X, but it does not have that sparkly sound that the 1990 Pro has, the Mark II, in that 8K region. Now I did measure a bunch of other beyerdynamic headphones as well, including the 770 Pro X limited edition and the older 770 Pro 80 ohms. So if you want to compare all that, again, I'll have a link in the description below, but hopefully that gives you an idea, at least on the measured side, how these stack up. As far as subjective sound quality goes, there'll be some similarities to what we saw in the measurements, but I also have kind of my own personal preferences and experiences because my ears and ear canal is different than my measurement rig, and we all have different preferences. So I want to start by comparing the two to each other from what I heard. Now, it's pretty obvious in the measurements, the closeback, the 1770 Pro Mark II, is going to have more bass, and it does. It sounds heavier, it sounds thicker, and the bass extension is deeper, especially when you're pushing it to a higher volume. So if you listen to a lot of rap, hip hop, or just like a lot of bass in general, then this is going to deliver that. Now, the biggest characteristic change is the pinna gain. You know, when you get into like the 4000 hertz area, this just with the cleaner bass profile sounds more natural and clean. It sounds more spacious. The biggest characteristic to how these present the sound is the DT 1770 Mark II, Pro Mark II, sounds a little bit more compressed and a little bit more dampened. And you have to deal with that when you have a closed back headphone because you have to deal with back wave reflections. And as you saw, this has some plastic behind the driver as well. But this just sounds a little bit more compressed and a little bit more dampened. It doesn't sound as lively. However, the bass is stronger. Now, they both have a very similar peak at 8000 hertz. It's just a matter of presenting it differently. And I think if you want a more relaxed vocal presentation and stronger bass, then there is a case for the 1770 variant instead. Whereas the open sounds a little bit more natural, and I think it's more versatile for different genres of music. Again, I think you really have to consider reducing the 8 kilohertz peak if you're sensitive to that. I am very sensitive to an 8 kilohertz peak, so this doesn't really align well for me. And just to be clear and open, on headphones that aren't known to be super strong at 8000 hertz, I do occasionally EQ that area down anyway for personal preference. I'm just more sensitive to that area. So these types of headphones don't suit my own personal listening preference or how I hear as well. So I don't want to hide that. Some people don't have this issue and they don't hear much of a peak at 8K at all. And this is going to sound fantastic because the bass delivery these have is great. They are a ton of fun for rock music. Even on the open back version, I like the way beyerdynamics sound for bass delivery. They're really fun, they're punchy, and if you're not trying to be an audiophile and analyze every single thing about the headphone, they can be a really fun listen. The other improvement that I like with this new Tesla 45 driver is it is more resolving and it's more detailed. Frequency response aside, you can boost mid-range and treble to make things sound more detailed, but at the end of the day, there is a certain level of resolution or lack thereof that some headphones just don't have, and it makes it sound worse and less clean. This is the biggest area where the new 1990 and 1770 Mark IIs have over some of their siblings, the less expensive variants of both, which is the 700 Pro X and the 900 Pro X. Then, when you compare it, I'm going to pull out a few because I want to talk about others as I keep getting into sound quality. You have the 770 series, and we have the older 1990s. So I'm going to start with the 1990 Pro Mark I because it's the closest thing, and people might have this and they're considering the new one. The new one is easier to drive. The new one is more resolving and clear. It's more detailed, and it has a similar sound signature. The biggest difference, we saw some on the measurements, but this has less, or the new version has less of a dip around the 8 kilohertz peak, so it sounds more, I guess, well presented or better balanced because there's other treble to kind of back up that 8K peak. In addition to being it slightly lower, this just sneaks up on you more. So this is where it's kind of caught people off guard because you have a darker treble, then this spike kind of hits you out of nowhere, and it kind of exasperates the issue. I do think the Mark II is a better headphone in essentially every way. It's more comfortable, it's easier to drive, and I like the tuning a little bit better than this. It's not my perfect cup of tea, but it is an improvement in basically everything. And then when you factor in distortion, EQ ability, the subtle details, it's definitely worth the upgrade today. Now this is a price cut, so you can take that for what you will, but I still would rather pay the extra to get that level of resolution and clarity. So now we get into these guys, which is really fun. You have the 900 Pro X and the 700 Pro X. They are in the middle in terms of pricing. They're about $250 to $300 depending on time of day, I guess. But the versions of these are a more tame frequency response, and they're also less resolving. They're less clear. So even if this had the same exact frequency response, and these are still easy to drive, 48 ohm, pretty sensitive, so you can plug this into anything. They're not like super high impedance. I like the frequency response of both of these more compared to the more expensive 1990 and 1770s. They don't really need EQ as much to me to enjoy it, and it's been really fun. And I've used the 700 Pro X a lot in gaming if I just want a comfy closed back headset at night. And because it's easy to drive, I've used this a lot on PlayStation as well. So frequency response is great, but when you hear it compared to the 1990, for example, with these two, I hear more of the subtle details better. It sounds more resolving and it sounds more clear. And that new Tesla 45 driver is the upgrade over the Stellar 45. They're all 45 millimeter drivers, but it's a different driver on this. Also has the different impedance trace and all of that. So I think it's worth it in terms of clarity, but you do want to consider EQ with this. Otherwise, if you can't EQ and you're okay with having things kind of smoothed over a little bit less resolving, then this is still a worthwhile pick. Now where it gets interesting is these guys. So you have the 770 Pro X, which has the same Stellar driver, the Stellar 45 of the 900s and the 700s. It's tuned to sound more like, in this case, the 1770 Pro Mark II. So if you want a more excited bass profile and a sparkly top end, more treble and a little bit more of that 8K peak, this is the less expensive version of this. So if you like the idea of what I'm saying of what the 1770 does, but you can't justify the $600 price point, for under $200, you can get a similar sounding headphone that's just less capable. It doesn't have the same EQ ability or clarity, in my opinion. Now, this isn't a bad headphone. I actually think the 770 Pro, the older version, the 80 ohm, is slightly better tuned than the new limited edition, but it doesn't have a detachable cable. It's not as comfortable, and it's harder to drive. It's also less friendly to EQ and really being pushed to the limits. I don't think it's probably the lowest performing one here in terms of overall clarity and EQ ability. It's an older driver, but the frequency response alone, I think it's a little bit easier to listen to than the Pro X. So I've said that before. I think a lot of these do require EQ to get the most out of them, but the 900s and the 700s to me are the closest thing to true plug and play. Now, even going beyond all of that, if you just start listening to music and we focus more on that, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day, these guys throw notes around you a lot better. And it's not just like the upper treble presentation. The imaging just sounds wider and more vast, even on the closed back version compared to something like the 700. This sounds more congested. This one, when you listen to a rock song or a really good or well-recorded acoustic, that really showcases why you're paying more for these guys. So if you want a more lively experience, not just the tuning, but in terms of overall musical presentation, I think they do a better job there. Now, my channel covers gaming audio as well, and if you don't care about that, use the chapters below to skip ahead. Some of this will have to do with soundstage and imaging, so if you care about that, maybe watch this anyway. So with that being said, you have to decide a very important form factor right off the bat, and if you want sound isolation or a more open presenting soundstage or imaging and all that, it sounds more vast and wide when you have an open back. A closed back typically sounds more compressed or closed off because they have to deal with reflections and the nature of being a closed back. The advantage of a closed back, though, is it greatly attenuates environmental noise. So if you're playing at a desk and you have a loud computer or your AC fan kicks on at night and it gets kind of loud, but you're trying to be more competitive and hear subtle details and footsteps and stuff, then a closed back is going to be a more performance headphone for you. If you have a very quiet room and noise isn't an issue, well, the open backs to me have a better sound presentation overall, and it sounds a little bit wider and easier to pinpoint audio cues as well, because everything sounds more clear and open. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but the Tesla 45 drivers have a really good matching characteristic to them, meaning that the left and right driver perform nearly identically from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So you don't have these weird dips of channel mismatches. That can happen from cup geometry, pad deformities, and driver imbalance itself. You know, you have a tolerance of how closely matched two individual speakers should be to each other. And usually in more affordable headphones, that tolerance is looser and you have slight channel imbalances as the frequencies change. And that's acceptable to an extent. These are incredibly tight. Of all the beyerdynamic headphones I've measured and tried, these have the tightest tolerances, which is great, and it really helps with imaging, which can associate for not only musical performance, but for gaming as well. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but when I play a lot of FPS games, this has been one of the closebacks I've typically gravitated towards. There's only a few closebacks I really like for gaming in terms of just a straight up headphone. And the DT700 Pro X has been fine for me because it does my noise isolation I'm looking for, but the stock frequency response just happens to work really well for FPS gaming because it's boosted more in the whole 2 to 3K area, which is more valuable in terms of emphasis for FPS games. These are a little bit more scooped in that regard because they're designed to sound wider and more airy. However, when you do EQ, the detail retrieval these have are superior. So if you could do EQ and spend more money, you're going to get the best performance possible with these new units. If you can't, then these are still excellent for gaming, and I prefer these much more over the less expensive models. They're not bad, but to me, you get a big step up in performance there. And that wraps up the video on these new headphones. I know these came out a little bit back in terms of when they were released versus when this video came out, but I just wanted to spend more time with them, and I really wanted to compare it for the to the other models as well, across the whole board of listening, music, gaming, you name it. And I wanted to make sure that you understood not only how these two compare to each other, the 1770 versus 1990 Mark IIs, but also to the other beyerdynamic headphones. You know, what are you getting when you pay more for each series of product? And I know this isn't all of them, but this should give you a pretty good idea. So I was very honest on the sound part. The 8 kilohertz peak isn't for me. It actually is pretty bad for me. And without EQ, I don't really enjoy this peak. It's just not for me. With EQ, they're much more enjoyable, and I can see a clear upgrade path from the other headphones in terms of clarity and overall performance. If that EQ peak isn't an issue, or you have other headphones from beyerdynamic and you love that house sound, these are awesome in that regard. They are an upgrade there. So there are going to be people that are very happy with this. And then you factor in the comfort, the build quality, the design aesthetic that a lot of people like. There's still a case for it. It's just not going to be for everyone. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching this. I really hope you got what you needed out of it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like what you see, so I can see you at the next one. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.